Hey everyone, welcome back to the Not Just Politics podcast. Today is, it's hilarious that I forget every time, Friday, March 22nd. The talks with, and you don't know about this, the talks with OpenAI have slowed down because this is a thing that I've been telling our fans is that I'm going to get replaced by AI. It's going to replace me, but Gavin is still going to produce. So that talks have slowed down, but eventually this will happen. And OpenAI's Sora will be the new host of the show. So just my tenure on this is coming to an end here. It is. Yeah, it's over. But we have a guest in the studio today. The founder and executive director of Rehumanize International, which is a secular, nonpartisan nonprofit dedicated to bringing an end to all aggressive violence against humans through education, discourse, and action to ensure that every human being's life is respected, valued, and protected. Aimee Murphy, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Carson.
Of course.
I'm glad to be here.
Did I get all of that right?
You did.
Okay, very cool. Her book, Rehumanize, A Vision to Secure Human Rights for All, will be available at the link in the description. It is a fantastic book. It is, I think the best part of this is the way that you identify how different groups of people will ignore different forms of violence against certain groups of people for ideological reasons, for political reasons. And I think that's kind of what I want to start with, if you don't mind.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the big blind spots of political ideologies and political parties, and how do you navigate that?
Yeah, I think the number one question that I like to ask to people when I'm doing any sort of outreach is, who are you leaving out? Mm-hmm. When it comes to your concern for human rights and human dignity, the lives and value of others, is there anyone that you're excluding? Mm-hmm. Whether that's intentionally or unintentionally. Because it can help reveal those blind spots. So when it comes to, folks who lean more conservative or identify with GOP politics, they can often leave out, people who are incarcerated, people who are on death row, the men who have been subject to decades of torture and indefinite detention at Guantanamo. Mm-hmm. They can leave out the immigrant and the refugee. They can leave out people subject to police brutality. Mm-hmm. They can leave out people subject to colonization. But on the other hand, we have, for those who lean more liberal or identify more with Democratic Party politics, they often are more likely to leave out the prenatal human, whether that's, at the embryonic stage, after conception, whether they're in the petri dish or in the womb, mm-hmm. or the fetal human. Or they might be more likely to leave out, disabled individuals or elderly people who might be subject to pressure to accept euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide. Or perhaps they might be, tempted to leave out why am I forgetting what else? No. They might be tempted to leave out, I think one of the highlights that we brought up is disabled prenatal humans, like this overlap of disability and prenatal humans, that we see in conversations about, quote unquote, like adverse prenatal diagnoses and things like that. So, neither side is truly consistent when it comes to support for human rights and human dignity, respecting the life of each and every human from the moment our life begins until the moment of our natural death. And so then the question becomes, how do we kind of annoy both sides in a productive way? How do we build those bridges to stop them from being comfortable in a status quo that supports violence, dehumanization, and oppression?
And another big, another main, I guess, part of this book is the consistent life ethic. Can you explain what that is to my viewers?
Yeah. So in a nutshell, the consistent life ethic is the belief that each and every human being has inherent dignity and worth. It's something that's just a part of us as a member, a living member of a species that has this rational capacity. And therefore, that each and every human being deserves to live free from aggressive violence. And what that looks like is, an opposition to different forms of violence like euthanasia, like the death penalty, like abortion, like unjust war, particularly the use of nuclear weapons, to physician-assisted suicide, to torture, to police brutality, to embryonic stem cell research and other forms of embryo destruction, and like torture in the carceral or just quote unquote justice system. And the list could go on. Like we could include other topics like human trafficking, abuse, domestic violence, and things like that. But in particular, we at Rehumanize International tend to focus on issues of violence that, number one, don't necessarily have broad cultural consensus that like these acts of violence are wrong. And number two, remain legal in some way, shape, or form. So we really are working on changing the culture to support human life in all these different circumstances, and hopefully in changing the culture also work on changing the laws.
Yeah, I think that is true. I think that's like an Andrew Breitbart quote, is that politics is downstream from culture. I have always thought that that's probably the way that you have to do it. You're not just going to... every successful human rights movement has done that. They've all had a cultural movement that's attached to legislation getting passed. And when you say you're like trying to productively annoy both sides, that is so funny because I have said that. Like even like in 2020 was just a year of people saying, well, that kind of chaos I don't condone, but this one I'm actually more okay with. Like that violence, not good. This one's fine. It was like whenever the George Floyd thing happened, everyone looked at that and thought, well, this is a terrible thing. Like, this is a act of violence that should not have happened, right? So then there was a whole, like, demonization of cops and the justice system. As soon as January 6th happened, people were like, no, these cops are heroes, and these ones aren't. So I just don't... Doesn't make any sense. And so... we met in Gettysburg. That's where we met, just for some context for people. We met at the Braver Angels convention in Gettysburg. What brought you to that? What brought you there?
Yes, we'd been connected with Braver Angels through the work of Leah Labresco Sargent. I have never actually spoken with her in person, so I don't know how to pronounce her married name. Anyway, she is a gem of a human and actually spoke at our conference this past fall on really this idea that like all humans are interdependent. And this idea of like a radical autonomy is actually contrary to human dignity in many ways because we are dependent on one another as a communal species. Anyway, so like we've worked with her over the years. She's written for us several times and been connected to our conference, et cetera. And so she at one point reached out and said, Aimee, I need someone to come on this Braver Angels debate on abortion. And I know that you have a really nuanced pro-life feminist perspective, and I would really like to feature you as one of the like featured debaters. And I was like, cool, yeah. What's your organization? I've never heard of this. And so she told me about Braver Angels, and we were immediately just enthralled. Like, this is so much the heart of the work that we do, is bringing people together across party lines to really have productive discourse. So after that, we learned about the convention, and we thought, oh, well, this is a fantastic opportunity to really engage in this discourse that we've been, trying to really amplify and exemplify in our own work. So, we took some of our team members there, and I, had a really productive time. We're hoping to go back this year, though I'm speaking at a different conference the same days as the convention this summer. So I won't be able to be there, which is such a bummer. But, we're hiring or in the process of hiring a new executive director.
Okay.
So that I can step back and work more on development. And so hopefully we can send the new executive director, whoever that is.
We'd love to meet up with them because we're planning on going as well.
That would be awesome.
We're gonna try. I haven't applied yet, but we're gonna try to get out there. That was a long convention.
It was.
It was 5 days. They made it 2 this year. I was like, thank God, kind of, because I love being there and seeing people. But 5 days in those dorms at Gettysburg College, I should have paid for a hotel room. If we would have known, we would have paid for a hotel room. And they weren't like horrible, but
No, they were great. I mean, me and my
fine.
husband went, and we each had to sleep in separate twin beds, and that was fine. You know, it works. You do what you got to do.
It was fun. It was also like, I mean, I understand the cultural moment that they were going for. It was the perfect place to have that, but I was like in the middle of the summer in Gettysburg. It was 80% humidity when we were there.
Yeah, it was toasty.
Okay, so is that something that you've struggled with, like feeling politically homeless? And have you felt that way? How long have you felt like that?
Oh Lord. I mean, I have not felt at home in either major political party since I was a teenager, honestly, like since I came to adopt this position. You know, at 16 years old, I was a pro-choice, liberal, feminist, queer atheist. And as a pro-choice kid growing up in California, it was just kind of like a given that if I was going to care about human rights, I was going to be a feminist. And if I was a feminist, I was going to be pro-choice. And so I kind of towed the party line on the Democratic Party because it was just like, oh, well, if I'm going to care about human rights, this is where I belong.
Yeah.
And then an ex-boyfriend who we'd been in an on-again, off-again relationship for a while, he raped me, and then a month and a half later, when I hadn't had a period, thought I was pregnant, he threatened to kill me if I didn't have an abortion.
Oh my God.
And the thing is, like, I had been considering abortion up until that point. Like, it was the only thing on my mind. I was top of my class. I was a starter on my JV basketball team, had just been pulled up to varsity for the, championships, the, what do you call it? The tournament, at the end of the season. And, I was also going to like all state honor bands. I was excelling both in my academics and my extracurriculars. And my teachers were totally convinced that I was headed to an Ivy League education. And so I was convinced, of course, that, because I had been told this lie that if I wanted to be an empowered woman and if I wanted to have success, that I could not have a child. And so abortion had been the only thing on my mind until he said that to me, until he said, Aimee, if you don't get an abortion, I might kill you. And in that moment, I think everything just kind of turned on its head. And I began to understand that violence could not be the answer to crisis. That what he was telling me in his moment of crisis was, you're an inconvenience to me and you're an inconvenience to my future. Therefore, I'm going to kill you. And in fact, I feel like I have the right to. And I realized that I didn't want to be like him, that I couldn't do that to someone else, much less a defenseless preborn child. And the thing is, like, I had taken biology. Like, I had already taken like the high school biology. He and I were in the same biology class, so I knew he had taken it too. And I don't think either of us had cared. I don't think he cared. But I certainly didn't care until that moment when suddenly I was like, wait a second. I've learned about this. I know that this is a living human being. Like, if I'm pregnant, that this child is worthy of the same rights and dignity that I have. And they're also deserving to live a life free from violence. And granted, like, I didn't have the consistent life ethic. I didn't have satyagraha or even like the term nonviolence as something to really grab onto. I was just like, killing humans is bad.
Yeah.
Right? Like, that was what my 16-year-old brain was processing at the time. And so I became really uncomfortable with the Democratic Party line. But at the same time, I was still a queer feminist atheist. And so going to the Republican Party also didn't feel like somewhere I would feel at And really, it's like in the search of trying to process out what my ethics were, what my beliefs were, I didn't even like comfortably straddle the party line. I was just like, this is all bullshit. And any sort of system that is making us choose between one human and another, between doing violence to one human or this other category of human, it's too steeped in dehumanization for me to be comfortable with it.
Yeah, it's not something that you can condone.
Right.
Probably can't, should not.
Right.
Could not.
Right.
Do not. Do. Yeah. I'm so sorry. That's horrible. That's genuinely
Thanks.
horrible.
Yeah.
I don't like.
It was a
I
lot.
kind of like. Oh. Okay.
You know,
How do you? Do you have? And I hope
Yeah.
this is okay question to ask.
Yeah.
Like, how do you trust people again after that?
That's a great
How do you trust me to sit down
question.
here?
That's an excellent question. It was so like this story was not something that I trusted people with at all. I eventually decided in my early 20s to become Catholic, and so like the first person I eventually trusted the story with was my spiritual director.
Okay.
Like the priest who really helped guide me back into the church. And I hadn't told anyone else. Like I had dated several other people and had not told them. And I eventually tried to tell one guy that I was dating who I thought, you know, like we were maybe endgame. Some of the story, and he was like, "You've been lying to me," and just like really just like damaged my trust even further. Because I was like, "No, I haven't been lying to you. I just haven't told you everything because I didn't know if I could trust you, and apparently I can't." And so that was really rough. Honestly, like there was a real moment of grace and love and goodness that came on my second date with my now husband. When he just asked me, like, why are you so pro-life? Like, why is it so important to you? Like, it's great. It's good. But like, I know a lot of pro-life people and none of them are as dedicated as you. Like, none of them are as passionate as you about this issue. And I just like word vomited my life story at him at the Qdoba on Center.
As you do.
Right. And instead of responding with angst or like I had been lying to him or anything like that, he was just like, wow, thank you so much for sharing that with me. That must have been really hard for you to go through and really hard for you to share with me now. It means a lot to me that you shared that with me. Thank you. And it just helped me to realize like his openness to really encountering me as a human being, I think really helped me to have the trust to be able to share that story with other people in the future, because I knew that I had one safe person on my team that I could share it with. Like my parents didn't know this story until I was 27 and giving a talk at the church that I had grown up in. And like my parents were sitting there in like the second row and my mom's like crying her eyes out. And she's, you know, afterwards she's like, I had no idea. And I'm like, yeah, I didn't tell anyone the full extent of what I was going through at the time. So, you know, being able to like really encounter the other person, I feel like that's actually like a part of what Braver Angels is about, is like really seeing the human being in front of you with all the dignity that they come to the table with and really embracing a posture of openness and humility and curiosity. And that's what my husband did for me. And I think it's why he actually enjoyed the Braver Angels convention in the end, was because he saw other people really engaging in that same posture.
Yeah, I think that is a part of what makes that organization great. Is you have to look at people for who they are, not who you want them to be.
Yeah.
That's kind of what you have to do. Wow. Thank you for sharing that with us today. I imagine that still can't be an easy thing to talk about. So I really do appreciate that.
You know, going to therapy is highly underrated. I highly recommend it to anyone who has some hurt in their past, because it can make a big difference.
And so you said so are you currently So you're not an atheist anymore.
I'm not. No.
Okay, so you flipped the other way, because I know a lot of people that grew up in the church and left.
Yeah.
You grew up without it and jumped in.
Well, I grew up with it, and then
Okay.
at like 14 years old, I was like, "This is garbage."
Okay. Okay.
You know.
Yeah, well,
And
that's
so
also
then-
common. A common
Right.
thing.
Right. And you know, there was certainly a lot of peer pressure from the kids that I was in class with. You know, that like, oh well, religion is garbage, and so there's no reason to believe it. You know, I eventually came back in part because I think that the Catholic Church is a really excellent, maybe not a track record, but a really excellent library of resources and even doctrine to even turn back to that really highlights the dignity of the human person in all stages and all circumstances. And so that was really convicting to me as someone who was like just really passionate about consistent life ethic stuff in college. Yeah.
Is there any part of does the Catholic Church stay pretty consistent with the consistent life ethic, or are there are there disagreements that you still have?
That's a good question. So the early church has a really strong history of the consistent life ethic. I would highly recommend a book by a friend of mine, Rob Arner, called Consistently Pro-Life. And it is about the history of total consistent adherence to nonviolence in the early church. I think with the evolution of the church that came after close alliance with political power, being the conversion of the Roman Empire under Constantine and later emperors, you really ended up seeing a pattern of justification of things like war and the death penalty.
Like crusades.
Yeah.
Or perhaps one of them.
Exactly. Which was not consistent with, in my opinion, either the teachings of Christ or the practice of the early church that was the closest to him. And really, I think a lot of these justifications stemmed from being so close to empire, being so close to that power that you really felt like you had to, or rather that the church at that time really felt like they had to justify that association. Whereas in the early church, like if there was someone who was, for example, in the military, in the Roman military, but they wanted to convert to become a Christian, they were told they either had to completely disengage from the military, like defect, or they had to change to a nonviolent role within the military. Like they could be like a palace guard that was there like just for appearances, basically. And like that was the rule at the time. And so I think that example was kind of lost in the effort to justify allegiance with empire, which is disappointing to me, certainly. And, you know, like there's lines from the Summa, St. Thomas Aquinas' work that talk about, you know, like, is the death penalty ever just, like that sort of thing. And like there's, you know, questions, answers, rebuttals, and that sort of thing. And basically he ends up saying, well, it would not be just to kill someone who was innocent because, you know, they're a human being and all human beings are made in the image and likeness of God, et cetera, et cetera. But the truly unrepentant criminal is like a monster or a beast, and so has lost his human dignity, and like that's his justification for why the death penalty is okay. When I think we can probably pretty clearly say, as people who I think have better access to people who are incarcerated these days than maybe in the past, that people who have done terrible things are still human, even if they've made terrible choices. And at no point is there a change in kind of what, this person, this prisoner has become. That just because someone has done a bad thing, even to the point of harming another human, doesn't mean that they can't in the future make a better choice to do better, to be better. And so then one of the things that Thomas Aquinas eventually says is, well, even if the person repents and has a change of heart and, becomes better, it's still maybe justified to kill them because the state has that power to punish someone. And so, I want to love everything that the doctors of the church say. I don't. And I think that these days, the church is definitely showing some steps towards, like Pope Francis has recently said that the death penalty is inadmissible in this day and age because we have the means to keep our society safe from people who might do others harm without needing to kill them, which is like sort of a step from the words of Pope John Paul II. He had a very similar idea that he worked from, which it's a step, it's a step away from the thought of Thomas Aquinas and those like him who really sought to uphold state power to violence. And I think that's a good thing. I think we should be challenged by the dignity of others instead of resorting to violence as the first thing.
And you briefly mentioned this, how someone can't, I guess, lose their humanity by doing something bad. So that's something you talk about in the book. You have a spectrum of innocence and then a spectrum of usefulness. And the point you make is that any line that you draw is arbitrary. Can you break that down?
Yeah. Gosh, I wish I could show everyone the little chart because I think it's been really illustrative in the past, for people to just see that. So page 17 and 18 in my book.
Yeah, I timestamped it. We can.
Yeah.
I'll clip these and we'll get them into the.
Excellent. Yeah.
I'll get those prepared.
So when we look at innocence, for example, so when we're talking about like this example from Thomas Aquinas, a lot of people, when trying to justify the death penalty, will say, well, that person, like, they're guilty of this crime and therefore it's okay to kill them. But ultimately, I think what that question does is it's asking who is innocent enough to live. And, like on the far end of the spectrum, we have, like an embryo or an innocent baby, who's never done anything but just exist.
Right.
Right.
Nothing good or bad.
Right. Just they're innocent of anything.
Right.
And then, somewhere in the middle, we probably have you and I, folks like us, your average Joe Schmo. And on the far end, you have people who have engaged in massive war crimes, in genocide and ethnic cleansing, in class warfare and stuff like that. So I have like Mao Zedong on one side. You could insert any number of other people who have engaged in these terrible, terrible crimes. And, maybe somewhere in there you have, to the right of the general population in the middle, towards those who are more guilty, you have perhaps two different people. One who killed 3 people intentionally and one who killed 3 people intentionally and 1 person by accident. And the question is, well, what if the one who's killed 3 people intentionally doesn't get the death penalty for whatever reason, but the one who killed 3 intentionally and 1 by accident, with manslaughter, like, is that the line that we draw, or do we draw it before that?
Yeah.
Do we, there are some people who want to kill rapists. There are some people who want to kill, pedophiles.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that killing people is the response that we should have, because ultimately every person on that spectrum is a human being, and drawing any line there is arbitrary. And, the reason that I eventually came to this idea of like innocence on a spectrum was because I had had so many conversations about abortion.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd ask people, like, where on the spectrum of life are you comfortable saying it's a human?
Mm-hmm.
Are you comfortable saying that killing that human, that being that is living, is wrong?
Mm-hmm.
And people had all these different arbitrary lines. Maybe it was 12 weeks, after the first trimester, when miscarriage is no longer highly likely. Maybe it was quote unquote viability, but viability is always changing, and it completely depends upon medical technology. And I think that really seeing that demonstrated to me how arbitrary of a line we were talking about. And that any line functionally being arbitrary, like if we're talking about viability as 22 weeks, but we have a baby born at 21 weeks, 4 days, 3 days before viability, right? Are we going to say, well, it's okay to kill them? Like we don't need to provide them care.
Yeah.
That line was so arbitrary, and functionally would result in the deaths of humans who still had value. And so like drawing those lines, these arbitrary lines, really what it does is it deprives certain humans of this same fundamental right that I think is core to who we are as human beings, just inherent in us, that we deserve to live free from aggression.
Mm-hmm. So, and this is something that I have, because I'm not a religious person. I believe in God. I believe that there's something. I don't know what it is. I can't describe it, but I find it kind of hard to believe that this whole thing is just the roll of the dice. We got lucky. Everything, it seems too designed, I guess. I make the design argument for why I believe in God, I guess. But
Sure.
I have always been of the belief that I do think that abortion is murder, and I don't like that I say this, but I still don't entirely know how to feel about it, because I have also had the stance that I don't think that I want to give. I guess I've made the argument that I don't want to give that power to government to decide whether someone can or cannot do that. So I've never been able to square that away. Can you potentially help me square that away? Because I don't know how to feel about it genuinely, and and maybe I will never figure out how I really feel about it. But it's just kind of been a tricky thing.
Yeah, I hear that. When I became pro-life at 16 years old, I was like, this is gonna ruin my social life. Like, this is gonna make me so unpopular. To have this stance, right?
Yeah, I'm not afraid of being labeled as unpopular by saying that I am pro-life, but I genuinely, it's just been a confusing thing.
Right.
And it's also not my thing to speak on because I'm a man.
I hear that. Yeah, I think, like when it comes to whose voices are more amplified, it should probably be women.
Agreed. Agreed.
I would also say abortion survivors, of which there are several. They actually just have established the Abortion Survivors Network, like people who survived abortion procedures. And, there are men in that category. So I think they should be listened to.
Sure.
Generally, I think, the thing is, anyone can hold a position on any form of violence, and in fact should, I think, and should oppose it. That's obviously my opinion. It's why I wrote the book.
Of course.
That being said, I think if we acknowledge abortion as the communal trauma that it is, I think we perhaps view the question differently.
Okay.
Because we are in a society, right, that is attempted to justify, like morally justify the act of abortion for so long. Like since at least Roe v. Wade in 1973, we've been in this situation where hundreds of thousands of women each year are having abortions in this country. And everyone knows someone. Everyone loves someone who has had an abortion. And I don't think that the pro-life movement does us any good by downplaying that fact. And so like we have to acknowledge that like there really is this ongoing systemic dehumanization of prenatal children that to a certain degree, I think mitigates the culpability of people who have engaged in abortion as a method of birth control or contraception. When it's not contraception, like conception has already happened, and what we're dealing with is the death of a human being. In fact, the intentional killing of a human being, of a human child. And when we take into account the responsibilities that humans have to each other, and particularly, I think, the responsibilities that parents have towards their children, I think we can very clearly say that child abuse and child neglect is a categorical wrong, right? Like it's objectively wrong. It should be illegal. The state should have the power to enforce that.
Yes. I would. I don't know if I've given that like a crazy amount of thought specifically, but I would generally say that yes, that should be one reason. That should be one place where the government should intervene, because some people just aren't good parents. Like,
I mean, there are people who make really bad mistakes, and there are people who make really neglectful mistakes, and people who make really dehumanizing mistakes. And in those cases, the state should have the power to step in and help the vulnerable child, the vulnerable and defenseless child, to be able to live a life free from violence. And I'm not even suggesting that there should be carceral penalties, that there should be retributive penalties for those parents. I think that the best recourse in those situations is to try to help those parents get healthy and get to a place where they can parent their children confidently. And with love and with care, right? Likewise, I think we should ask ourselves why we draw an arbitrary line about which children are deserving of that protection from the law, right? And so by saying, oh, well, you know, like once that child is out of the womb, it doesn't matter. Once a child is out of the womb, it does matter whether their parents are doing neglectful, abusive, or otherwise harmful things towards them, and the state has the power to step in. But prior to that, if parents intend to harm their prenatal child, the state doesn't give a shit. Like that doesn't make sense. Like that's another arbitrary line that we're drawing. And so I think, again, the response doesn't need to be carceral. It doesn't need to be retributive. I think we should be asking questions about why do people feel like abortion is their only option when they're resorting to it? What is it about our society that makes pregnant people and their partners feel like killing my child is the best option right now?
Yeah.
And so, like, you know, we have to respond to that, I think, with curiosity, and with kindness, and with an eye towards restoration to community as a whole. And this is where I think my philosophy of human dignity really intersects with what does a rehumanizing justice system look like. And in that case, I think that, well, in the case of abortion, but I think in cases generally, that the response of asking what harm has been done, what needs to happen to make amends to those harms, and how do we heal from this. It's perhaps most important in the case of abortion because we do have this communal trauma where we have systemic dehumanization. Likely we have not only the pregnant person, also their partner, also their families, also their friends and the community who may have participated in that, the physician, the physician's staff, maybe the person who drove them in the Uber who didn't know where they were taking them. Like, just violence has so many tendrils that it reaches into our communities and causes trauma. And I firmly believe that hurt people, but that healed people can heal people. And so when we ask the questions of, like, what harm has been done and how can we heal from this, we're not just looking for punishment. In fact, we're not looking for punishment at all. We are looking for real restoration of communities harmed by the trauma of violence. And so it becomes a completely different conversation at that point, in as far as, should the government have this power? Like, well, the government has power in a lot of ways to prevent violence against you or I, or against children. And I think that should extend into the conversation around abortion as well.
Does that conversation about addressing why people feel the need to get an abortion, does that lead you down a road for a conversation about healthcare, the sexual revolution, and hookup culture? And like, there's a lot of what do you think the main roots of that problem are?
I mean, I think the reason that most people feel like they need to have an abortion is, statistically speaking, economics. Basically, people don't feel like they have the resources to be able to parent that child confidently. And the thing is, like, that, yes, it could be just economics, but it could also be family support. It could be feeling like, or knowing that their academic life would be put in jeopardy, because a lot of colleges are not supportive of pregnant and parenting students. It could be a situation where their family members would kick them out. The same way that we're also thinking and talking about queer people, queer kids getting kicked out of their family homes. There's so many different issues that we could talk about that could be solved, I think, through greater societal support for pregnant and parenting people generally. I think there are different opinions among the Rehumanize board and team generally about whether that should come from charities or whether that should come from the government. I think that's something that's really cool, actually, is like we have a board and a team that comes together around the consistent life ethic, but that varies widely when it comes to like economic policies and sometimes like social policies and stuff otherwise. And it's a good back and forth. I think it creates a good space for creative solutions, really creative solutions that highlight the need for nonviolence, but also highlight the need to affirm the life and dignity of every human in all circumstances. Yeah.
And then there's also, I mentioned this briefly, and again, we'll throw this one into the in post, the usefulness spectrum. So on one end, you have so I guess I'll explain it. I'll verbally explain it this time. On the far left end, you have a newborn baby, and then it goes a 2-year-old that knows their ABCs, an elderly person with Parkinson's disease. We're getting closer to the middle. The average high schooler is next, and then in the middle there is, again, most of us. And then after that, it's an astrophysicist with O-type blood and good health. Very rare type of person. A surgeon who does woodworking in his spare time, and then Leonardo da Vinci. So again, any line, the argument is that any line here we draw is arbitrary.
Yeah. And I think the thing that I eventually wanted to point out with this is that drawing a line of who is useful enough to live is, again, it's an arbitrary line. And all of us will be at different stages, be at different points on that spectrum, just like the spectrum of innocence as well, at different points in our life.
Yeah.
And that's good and that's fine, you know? And how useful a person isn't functionally the end all be all of a human being's worth. Aged and disabled people often produce less things than, like your average college student or, someone who works, like a labor job or whatever, and functionally that doesn't touch their dignity. Their lives still have value. Our lives have value when we're born. Our lives have value before that. Our lives have value from the moment we first begin to exist. And our lives will have value when we're elderly and disabled. And I always like to point out this line from some of my favorite disability activists, which is that we are all temporarily, well, maybe not all of us, because there are some people who are disabled their whole lives, but most of us are only temporarily non-disabled.
That's very true.
At the beginning of our lives, we are highly disabled. We depend on adults or older siblings or, like older people in general to do almost everything for us. And we will end our lives very similarly unless we die young for some reason.
Or you're that one 90-year-old that still runs marathons, because every once in a while you see one of those.
Yeah, but even that 90-year-old who runs marathons, presumably would still get older and would develop some sort of disability condition in their old age, right?
Yeah. Yes.
But kudos for running a marathon at 90. That's hella rad. And so then it seems that drawing a line to say, who is useful enough to live is arbitrary. It doesn't take into account this fundamental fact about who we are as human beings, which is that we have a nature of human being, right? We have a human nature that we have from the very beginning until the very end that exists at every point from the moment of sperm egg fusion at fertilization, at conception, and at the moment of death, and every moment in between. And it's not something that we lose. This rational nature isn't something that we lose when we're in a coma. It's not something that we lose when we're asleep. It's not something that we lose when we've been to a frat party and had way too much to drink and are passed out drunk on the couch. It's not something that we can forfeit based on guilt or usefulness or even whether or not we're currently conscious. It's something that we have as part of our essence. And so that's, I think this core value that we can get back to really evaluate, are these different categories of things that our political situation might polarize us about, whether it's usefulness or innocence or age or ability or any of those categories are not fundamentally things that touch the core of our being, which is human.
Yeah, that's a line that I like. There is no sort of non-human. Or no, there is no sort of human, I should say.
Yeah.
That's I do think that the dehumanizing of people that we disagree with and that are different from us is probably. Do you think that's the biggest underlying thing, is the dehumanization of other people, or is it I guess, is it societal systems, but do those also rely on? I was going to say, it seems like no matter where you would go with this, at the end of it, you would get to people not seeing each other as people.
Right. Yeah, I think dehumanization, if not the core issue, is certainly a core issue that we're dealing with in this era. I include in the book this quote that really gets at this idea of American first, human brother second. sort of idea that I think has really permeated a lot of, like, I'm just going to say American society in general. Like, I don't think it's just a problem on the conservative end of things. I think it exists on the liberal end too. And it's just one example of dehumanization, right? But 14 New England Catholic bishops wrote in response to the Vietnam War this quote that I think just like perfectly encapsulates what our responsibility is. We must in conscience criticize the ethical validity of any doctrine, attitude, or policy which seems to give American lives an intrinsic superiority over those of other people. Every human life, regardless of nationality, color, or ideology, is sacred, and its defense and protection must be of deep concern to us.
We'll also throw that in. I'll take pictures of all this and
thanks. Yeah.
get it in there.
Because I think it's crucial to be able to point out, like, it's not only these lives in this category, in this socioeconomic bracket that matter.
Yeah.
It's not, only white rights or male rights or homeowner rights. Like, it's human rights that we're talking about right now. And so that the most basic human right of them all is to live a life free from aggressive violence. Because if we don't have that, we have nothing. Like, we don't have a right to autonomy if our right to live free from violence isn't first respected. We don't have a right to, like freedom of religion or freedom of speech or any of those things if our right to live free from violence isn't first protected.
Yeah, I think that's like social contract theory. It's the idea that we give up 20% of our freedoms. That's maybe a bad analogy, but it's like you give up your right to just go do crazy shit in the street and harm people in exchange for the very basic it's for safety being guaranteed and for civil society being guaranteed. So in the book, and you did mention this, you lay out the conditions for a justifiable war. There are 5 aspects that you mentioned, and that is a just cause, competent authority, proportionality, the probability of success, and the last resort of violence and the least amount of violence essentially you can get away with. You called it last resort and least force. So how, just looking at the world right now, how does the war in the Ukraine fall under this? What does a proportionate and justified response look like from the Ukrainian people? And just your thoughts on that whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are several examples that we could go to discuss just cause. I mean, like, the right of the Ukrainian people to stand up against an oppressive invading Russia is certainly a just cause, right? You could talk about in World War II, hypothetically speaking, the U.S. entering the war to prevent the Holocaust. That was not actually what happened, but hypothetically speaking, that could have been a just cause, right? In the Civil War, hypothetically speaking, you could have the Union fighting a war to prevent the wholesale dehumanization and oppression and enslavement of Black people. Again, that's not exactly what happened, but you have a hypothetical just cause there. Other than that, one of the things that is really important about just war theory, just war doctrine, however you want to put it, really just like a theory of just defense, is that all of these categories need to be met. It isn't just, if you have a just cause, you can do whatever the fuck you want. Excuse my language.
So you're allowed to swear.
Thank you.
I swear all the time on this show.
People who are engaging in war still have to engage in it in a way, or engaging in defense still have to engage in it in a way that sees and respects the inherent dignity of those on the other side, which is I would say almost impossible in this day and age, given the weaponry that we have. And, like given the technology that we have that has been used so often to dehumanize, like just for example, one example, drone warfare, where you have drone pilots basically playing a video game in the United States, but killing people in the Middle East.
Yeah.
And they don't have the same forms of trauma that, like men on the ground do, because the dehumanization is so ingrained. It's so separate that it allows for it. And I'm going to be totally honest. I don't think that forms of defense and warfare should be that dehumanized. Like, if we allow for that level of dehumanization in our warfare, in our defense, what we're basically allowing is further dehumanization and unjust violence to enter the picture. Like, people should be traumatized by harming another human. Like, that's psychologically part of how we're wired as humans, is if we harm another human, there should be something morally upset in ourselves.
Because otherwise we've either been taught or learned on our own that there's a justification for that.
Yeah. And usually that justification is not seeing the other side as at all human. And so this is, like when I was talking about, all these different categories need to be met. The difficulty with most of these is that you might have, like some degree of competent authority. That's another one that's fairly easy to be able to meet. The United States hasn't met the burden of competent authority in a really long time. Like a really long time. But a lot of other nations can and probably do. I don't know all the ins and outs of, like parliamentary procedure and those sorts of things in other nations, but I know at least in the United States it hasn't been met because Congress has to authorize all declarations of war, and that hasn't been done since World War II. Anyway, when it comes to proportionality, that is one thing that I think is difficult to identify, or rather to, what's the word? Proportionality is difficult to meet because of, again, the violent technologies that we've been so good at creating since, since the Great War, since World War I. The technologies that we've created have just increasingly been dehumanizing. And one of the things that I mention in the book, I don't know exactly on what page, but it's definitely in this, I think it's in this Just War section. But it's about this idea that, it might be in the war section. It's probably in the war section. Anyway, at least in the United States, military training changed drastically after World War II because they ran the statistics and they found out that only approximately a quarter of all infantrymen, aka men who were sent there with guns to shoot others, only about a quarter of them actually fired on the enemy when they were actually engaged in battle. And so our military saw that and was like, that's too low. Our men have too good of consciences and they don't want to be responsible for killing another human. And so we need to change something because the targets that the men had been trained on were like, your standard round bullseye target. And so after World War II, the firing training changed, and they changed the, the firing targets that men were trained on to be silhouettes. human silhouettes so they would be more comfortable with shooting at a human. And eventually this reflexive fire training changed the outcome so drastically that I think in the Vietnam War, it had changed to be something like 75%. And in more recent conflicts, it's upwards of 80 to 90%. Again, I don't know the exact statistics, but it is somewhere in the book. One of the over 500 citations definitely includes that. And so, like, when you look at that sort of training, I think the question becomes, can there be a proportional response when you have that combined with the truly horrifying lethal power of the weapons that we can put in soldiers' hands these days?
Yeah.
When it's rooted in dehumanization and basically the dulling of moral sensitivities for men to be more comfortable with killing other men, or humans to be more comfortable with killing other humans. And then finally here, well, I guess there's probability of success, which is so difficult to quantify.
Incredibly tough. Yeah.
And there are, you know, like, even I think this happened just last week, maybe earlier this week, I don't remember. But I saw a headline about how Pope Francis had asked Ukraine to wave the white flag to end the conflict from their end. And, you know, there were a lot of people who were really upset about that idea. But basically, I think what Pope Francis was trying to get at was the probability of success here is so low that ending this conflict against a nuclear superpower could be futile and could just result in more deaths of more humans on both sides.
Yeah.
And instead of gaining a lasting peace, you're just looking at more and more and more violence. And so then the question becomes, have we engaged in enough diplomacy to really justify this ongoing violence? And so this gets at the last idea here, last resort and least force. Last resort is such an unexplored idea because I don't think we have an excellent concept of encounter and diplomacy on a national level in this era. I don't know if we ever had it in human history, but it's certainly something that we don't have right now. When we aren't asking questions about, are there creative ways that we could end this conflict?
Yeah. Kennedy did with the Cuban Missile Crisis.
That was an interesting case.
He refused to do it. He wouldn't.
Right. So, I mean, certainly something to study and to come back to.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think of, like, when I'm just trying to think, like, the 14 points peace plan. Like, we did fight World War I, but Woodrow Wilson was very insistent on not punishing Germany and bringing them back into the fold, and no one listened to that.
Right.
But otherwise, I'm just trying to think, like, not that I can really remember.
Like, the thing is, like, there have been glimpses, there have been examples, but I don't think it's something that's widely practiced, and it's certainly not the general rule, right? That we need to be engaging in a proactive and creative nonviolent diplomacy from the get-go. So we're not asking, 5 years into a conflict, why are we doing this?
That was Afghanistan.
Exactly.
That was Afghanistan.
Exactly. Yeah. That's my point.
And the trauma that those men have come back with is absolutely staggering. The amount of them that kill themselves every month, the amount of them. And I've just heard conversations. Now I've recently started to hear some veterans that have left, some veterans that have been talking about, like, were we even the good guys? Like, even now they're starting to, question. And I'm sure they have had so many sleepless nights over stuff like that. It's crazy.
Right. I definitely here want to highlight the work of, like, excellent people that I know in the anti-war movement, and particularly those who are involved with groups like Veterans for Peace, who have been there. They have done that. They have been part of the military-industrial complex. They've been part of that machine that just grinds men into dust. Yeah. And they have come back saying this is dehumanizing not only for the people on the other side, but for us. For us who said, we wanted to serve our country, we wanted to, give back to this nation, and instead we've been served a lifetime sentence of post-traumatic stress.
Yeah.
And it's heartbreaking, it's horrifying, and to think that we allow, as a nation, we allow military recruiters to go into our high schools to meet with our most financially disadvantaged children, and for the military recruiters to be able to give them an offer of, you'll have a guaranteed income, you'll have guaranteed housing, for your family, you'll have guaranteed health care, and a guaranteed pension when the time comes. To be able for them to offer all of that to our most impoverished
They tried to get me.
class. Yeah.
They tried to get me multiple times. Yeah.
And basically what we're doing when we accept that is we are accepting that we are comfortable condemning the poorest members of our society, and particularly the poorest children in our society, to a lifetime of recovering from trauma. Like, it's so cruel. Like, it's its own form of class warfare. I don't think I've ever thought that before.
No, but it kind of
so
is.
dark.
It's kind of a good point. I mean, and no one's going to want to hear me say this. No one's going to like this, but there are plenty of people in this country that do not want that war in Ukraine to end. There are plenty of people that have a vested interest, and they're making a lot of money off of that conflict going on for as long as possible.
Right.
So now, and I noticed that. I was like, man, they're not going to, the Pope's out of here. Like, they're going to try to get rid of him now because he said the one thing that you can't say. You can't, like Tim Dillon made a good point, my favorite comedian. He was like, the Pope could go on The View and say that I'm pro-life. And that's fine. Like, people are going to get mad, but that's what he could do it.
Right.
But as soon as you say that, hey, I think that, and again, I want no war. Like, can that be my position? Please, can someone let me just have the position that I don't want? Like, whenever Trump said that, whenever Trump was like, I want people to stop dying, the woman from CNN was like, oh, but do you want? And it's like, no, we want people to stop dying. Can that not be a basic position that I would just like human life to not be ended without getting into all of the messy? We're dealing with the two most corrupt countries in Europe, and that's saying something because there's a lot of corruption over in Europe. Like, we're saying something. Can we please? But yeah. So now here's my question: based on all this, has America ever fought a just war?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay.
I mean, I don't know everything about every conflict. I've obviously, I've done my share of research. But I don't think that all of the requirements for a conflict to remain just have been met by any of the conflicts in human history. I mean, in American history.
Sure.
I think a lot of people point to the Civil War and they're like, oh, that's probably just, or like the Revolutionary War. And I'm like, the Revolutionary War? Really? That's an interesting idea.
Based on this criteria?
And then when we look at...
so here's my question then about the Revolutionary War is when the communication is so... I haven't thought this through, but I'm thinking like when the communication between King George and the colonists is so slow, and they've made multiple attempts at addressing their grievances, and those have been ignored, and they're being continually, it's a word that's been watered down, but like oppression, like they're being oppressed by the King of England. What else would they have done, or should they have done?
I think you can look to nonviolent movements historically to see like some examples. Like, I'm not saying like you prescribe one thing and that's the answer.
Sure.
But there have been so many examples in obviously like Gandhi's movement in India, MLK's movement here in the United States. There have been movements in South America. There have been movements in Europe where you see a strong commitment to nonviolence and therefore also a strong commitment to encounter. And when you demonize the other side, which is something that I think kind of happened when it comes to the Revolutionary War and the demonization of King George. Like, he was not a good guy, but I think there were other options that could have existed. And like, when we're talking about oppression by like taxes, like, I have more taxes.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, that's a fair point. It was mainly over taxes. It was over some other stuff too, I believe. And there was like people did die, but that is a good point. Like the main thing was like was the economic side of that.
Right. And like even when it comes to the Civil War, where we have like a hypothetically very just reason, very just cause that could have been brought, aka the liberation of enslaved peoples. The reason instead was to keep the Union as one.
Sure.
Which is a sort of interesting cause in the first place. I don't know how I feel about it. But nonetheless, you have like Sherman's March to the Sea. A very disproportionate, unjust action that resulted in just horrific war crimes against civilians in the South.
Yeah.
Which is not at all to justify the horrors of slavery and that institution. But they didn't have to
burn down.
Right, like burn down whole cities in order to do that. There are just ways to achieve ends and there are unjust ways to achieve ends. And I think, so that's the question is like, are we meeting all of those different requirements if we want to engage in a conflict in the first place? And then of course the question is, why do we want to engage in a conflict? Why do we want that? Is it a last resort or is it something that we want?
I think a better last resort would be that whoever wants to start the war, we just have Dana White and the Paul brothers orchestrate a fight. And would that not be better? Like the two people that are beefing can fight. Don't send innocent young men to go shoot each other in a field. And I know that you're not going to, it's violence. They're still fighting each other. So like, I won't ask you to condone that. But like, that's my thought is like, let these two people get in the octagon with gloves and a good referee. Joe Rogan can be the referee.
I've often proposed that maybe a basketball game, a footy game, right? Play soccer or something like a mathletes competition. Like, I don't care. Let's do something that, like, it doesn't have to be bloodshed. We could come up with other creative options. I mean,
it's funny that you say a basketball game because Bridge USA posted a graphic of Trump and Biden going at it on a basketball court. Like, so I think that would be fine. They're going to be on so many drugs anyway that they would probably be able to actually play basketball. I think they might actually be able to play because they're going to be on, I mean, who knows what it's going to be. It's going to be a brain chip. It's going to be Pfizer. It's going to be Moderna. It's going to be somebody. But it's going to be, that first debate is going to be, I will be watching like it's the Super Bowl. I don't care about sports. That's the Super Bowl for me.
Okay.
Is that first debate. Because who even knows? But I digress. I want to go back to this. So,
yeah.
Again, I don't want to make this episode super heavy, but like we're already here.
Talking about violent issues and the way that they're entrenched in our culture is a heavy topic. Yeah. Like, I have come to terms with the fact that everything I talk about in my book is so heavy that people have had to put it down and walk away and be like, I'll come back to it later.
Yeah, that's what happened when I read the Gulag Archipelago. I had to put that book down. I was listening to it, but I had to stop listening to it. Whenever he spent an entire chapter, 35 minutes, talking about all the intricate ways they tortured people, I was like, I don't need to listen to this right now. I'll be honest. I will say you may have done well in that this book is less heavy than the Gulag Archipelago, more readable than the Gulag Archipelago.
That's something, I guess.
I don't know, but I mean, it is heavy. But how do and again, if you don't wish to talk about this for any lengthy period, we don't have to. But what about the situation in Gaza?
Yeah,
that whole thing.
Yeah,
what does has? Because it seems like Israel has whatever a proportional response looked like. It appears that they have surpassed it a long time ago. And I am of the belief that if you get attacked by a terrorist organization and they kill innocent members of your society, you have to do, I don't know, what do you, like, you have to do something. I don't.
I think it's an interesting question, and it goes back decades, if not centuries.
It goes back.
Like how could we be in a different situation right now? Number one, like it's such a fascinating and also horrifying thing to me that the British colonized after the Ottoman Empire, basically gave them that land. And then the British, acting like the land was their own and not the land of the sovereign various tribes of Palestine, decided that, oh, well, that land was theirs to give to European Jewish people who hadn't really had ties to Palestine, Jerusalem, that land, in centuries, if not millennia. And so what you end up with is displaced Palestinians thrown out of their farmland, thrown out of their hometowns, driven from that land, some of whom became refugees in Europe, in the United States, in other parts of the world, and some of whom moved to Gaza. And you ended up with this, almost the way we have a Pan-African identity of, like the Black American in the United States, because so many, Black people had been brought here on slave ships, had been enslaved, and had no connection to their homeland in Africa. There, in this diasporic movement, there was this, Pan-African identity. Likewise, for those Palestinian people who had identities based on their tribe, based on their city, their town. I recently, by recently I mean last summer, got to go to the Museum of the Palestinian Peoples in DC, which I highly recommend visiting if you ever have the opportunity. And one of the maps that they have is a map of the different dress and the different tatris of every city in Palestine. And it was so cool to see all the different designs of tatris embroidery that each city had, and like the different sorts of identities that these different tribes had. But there was no concept of this in the clearing of Palestine for the creation of this new Israel. And so what you end up with is a pan-Palestinian identity for the people who live in Gaza, which is very different from the identity that they had, under Ottoman rule, even under British rule. And with so many people displaced from their homeland, from their farms, from what they had known and loved and generations of their families had been raised on.
Yeah.
You have this massive societal trauma for Palestinian peoples.
There's generational hate that is born, and same with Russia, Ukraine. Like that is generational hate that is going to take a long time to get worked out.
Yeah, I mean, it's this hurt that is manifesting in this, like lashing out, right? I think it's what you see in Palestine, like from Palestinian people, for the same reason that you see anti-American terrorist regimes pop up in the Middle East, because the United States has treated all these Middle Eastern peoples as less than human.
We've tried to westernize all of those countries. We've spent so much time just blowing shit up just so we can fix it.
That's the thing, is like, it's violence for the sake of quote unquote democratization
and national security.
And right, and
it's always
like
about safety.
It ends up being this colonization by violence that results in backlash. And so what is the best way to deal with Hamas and terrorists, or, some Palestinians will call them freedom fighters, because they've been subject to oppression and violence from the IDF for decades. How do you respond to that? Well, you don't establish Israel on stolen land in the first place. You met me at Braver Angels, where I was, wearing my land back earrings because I'm descended from indigenous peoples, and like the land back movement is something that I'm really passionate about here in the U.S. Right? It's so like that's a first place you start from, is you don't steal people's land, you don't do violence to the people, you don't send them away and dispossess them of everything.
Sure.
Number one. Number two, in light of the situation that we had now, I think the question is, like, how can Israel, instead of perpetuating a cycle of violence and a cycle of harm, how could Israel respond in a way that would exemplify peace, fraternity, and diplomacy? And bombing Gaza to dust isn't that, right? Like starving Palestinian children is not that.
Yes.
Certainly.
For sure.
And there are some people who say, Israel has the right to defend itself. I think it is nearly impossible to defend oneself against a terrorist regime. And this is one thing that I've talked about in some of my talks, like, how do you respond to an amorphous idea?
Yeah, at the end of the day, you are trying to fight an idea. You are fighting an ideology.
Right.
It's tough.
It's not just that you are attempting to fight another nation, because the Palestinian people, by and large, are innocent in this situation and are being collectively punished by the Israeli government. This gets back to another idea that I talked about a little earlier, which is this idea of like this communal trauma. Everyone knows someone who has had an abortion, right? In Israel, everyone knows and loves someone who has served in the IDF, because everyone has to.
Right? Yeah.
Right? And so when you have a system where everyone has to serve in a military, then everyone in that society is going to be invested in making ethical justifications for not only the existence of the military as a whole, but also the military's actions.
Yeah.
Which is going to create just this mess of a web of like you're mixing trauma response with dehumanization, with just generational hurt, because you still are dealing with a situation where most of these people are descended from European Jewish people who were subject to violence during the Holocaust. And there's just so much healing that could be done, I think, by authentic peacemakers, instead of going into these spaces with bombs and guns and tanks. If we went in with therapists and just a curiosity and a humility to have people meet and actually talk, where you could probably come up with a creative and nonviolent solution. But that hasn't been what we've seen. I think by and large, what I've seen is two peoples talking past each other.
Yeah.
And the Israeli government taking more land at the expense of often the homes
With the settlements.
And yes, with the settlements, at the expense of the homes and the land and the dignity, that comes with being able to work your own land and the lives of Palestinian people. And so it's a mess.
Yeah, it is.
Right? Like it's so messy, and part of me, not just part of me, I think all of me wishes that we weren't in this situation in the first place, that things had been different when our world was thinking about how do we respond to, all this harm that was done to the European Jews.
Yeah.
I also have to say, I think the creation of Israel as an ethno-state also creates a larger opportunity for anti-Semites around the world to ascribe things to Judaism that are not inherent to Judaism, right? Because there is a conflation of Israel, the state, with Jews generally. And we see this with backlash against anti-Zionist Jews who will speak out and say, not in my name. Don't do these war crimes for me. Like,
Sure.
this is not for me. But the pro-Zionist or, like pro-Israeli Jewish people will lash back and will say, you're not really a Jew. It's like the no true Scotsman argument. So it's a mess. And I think the best that we can do is try to listen to those peacemakers who are coming together from both sides, who are coming together with people from the outside, to really ask the needed questions, which is, how do we get here? How can we fix this? How can we meet the needs of the innocent people who are being subject to this? And, how can we move forward in a way that respects everyone's dignity? I don't necessarily think those are the questions that are being asked right now, and I wish they would.
I would assume probably not. I just want to briefly ask you this question. When you talk about the stolen land argument, I don't know if this is... It's not that I don't want anyone taking land from anybody, so I'm not saying pushback, because I'm not saying, like, I actively disagree with you that I would prefer that people take each other's land. But hasn't that been the reality of humanity with everybody? Hasn't everyone stolen land from someone at some point in time? Maybe with the exception of uncontacted tribes that live in small islands in the middle of the ocean in those situations. But like Native American tribes did war with each other. They, I would imagine, at some point occupied land that belonged to another tribe. So is the argument that it's... And I could understand like how the creation of America with this is that it's people coming in that have better technology. It's people coming in that are more technologically advanced. So perhaps we should have known that this was not, in hindsight, the right thing to do.
I think if you look at the history of dehumanization of Indigenous people, you see that it often comes tied up with the stealing of land. And this idea, that quote unquote lesser people don't deserve their own land that they're on.
Yeah, it's crazy.
And so like when you're talking about, like Indigenous tribes battling each other, which I'm sure happened, you're also, I think, potentially disregarding the diplomatic relationships that also
That's fair.
happened.
That's totally
within
fair.
those relationships, and like also for some, like the nomadic existences of tribes and like how they would migrate and things like that. So, for those tribes, I think generally you are probably existing in a space of peers against peers, right? And it's, certainly within the realm of possibility, and I don't know, the full extent of every indigenous tribe in this country, in this world, etc. I'm sure that there were cases where you had a larger, more advanced tribe do violence against a, less advanced and you'd say more marginalized tribe. And that's not something that I think is okay.
Yeah, to be clear, neither do I. I'm not.
Right. Nonetheless, I think specifically when we're talking about, like, this is a situation of, like, really explicit colonization in the United States, where people from a completely different continent came in, treated the indigenous people as less than human, and then dispossessed them, like intentionally dispossessed them of their land to take it from them. That's not cool. I think it's also worth acknowledging that, of course, like the history of like the possession of land in the Middle East generally, but like specifically like Palestine, through Syria and down through Egypt, like that whole region that some people might call the Holy Land, like it went back and forth a lot.
Yeah.
Like people moved, like they were nomadic. They would move based on famine. Like they would move based on desire to marry into another family. Like land changed hands a lot. If nobody was living there, sometimes they would just be like, oh, this is my land. If other people were living there, there would be battles fought. Those sorts of things happened. I think that a lot of the ideology that rests in the Zionist justifications is like, oh, well, it's biblical that this land is supposed to belong to the Jewish people. And therefore, that's why it's okay to dispossess, these people who have been living there for centuries, whose families have raised up these olive trees for thousands of years. So I think, it's an interesting and complicated question that I don't have all the answers to. I think if people with enough knowledge and enough connection to that land can come in and talk to each other, well, they'd probably come up with something more creative than what I could.
Sure. Yeah. Sure. What are your thoughts on the totality of the American experiment?
Wow. That's a big question. I mean, it's all consuming. I think in most ways. I have complicated feelings about being American, as I think most people who are, citizens of the United States of America should feel. I think being a citizen of a nation that is engaged in so much colonization and so much widespread violence and so much systemic dehumanization, everyone who's part of that should be unsettled, uneasy at the very least. I don't know. We have such a complicated history as a nation, and such a really, like, I would say, like a consuming ideology that I think the thing that I want to challenge myself about, and, you know, like others who are here, is to allow yourself to think outside of the prescribed boxes that you think you have to fit into because you're, you know, a citizen of this country.
What boxes? Do you have any in particular you could think of?
I mean, for one, just
This idea that we're the best.
right.
This idea that America is number one. The idea that we have to go and destabilize countries to create an enemy so that we can have people be unified by something. This idea that we would push Russia further and further away from the... And I don't condone what they're doing in Ukraine. It's horrible. But this idea that you would constantly create a villain in Russia. Ever since the Cold War, you would intentionally push them away so that you had something to fight back against.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the history of the Cold War, just doing the research for the book, but also like wanting to continue reading about it, it definitely made me question like some of the history that I'd been taught. And then, you know, like even some of the things that I was living through. Like I had a friend who worked who was in the military and worked for the School of the Americas. And after he got out of the military, he was like, wait, what I was doing here was so wrong. Like, I helped train the type of people that killed all these nuns and killed all these women and children to destabilize these countries in order to bring in, quote unquote, you know, American democracy. And so, yeah, you know, number one, this idea that America's the best. Number two, like, you know, just our partisan politics, like thinking in these two separate boxes. I think that's something we need to reevaluate is, you know, like we've been given this system. Does it mean that we need to stick with it?
Sure. Yeah, and I guess so what do you think what does it mean to be an American then? That's another big question, but it's a question I try to ask everyone on this show.
Oh boy.
Because I've also felt the same way. I mean, the history that we're not taught is so crazy. The fact that Abu Ghraib is not taught in schools, the fact that CIA black sites, the fact that MK Ultra, Midnight Climax, Mongoose, all these, like, just go Google them. And these aren't conspiracy theories. Like, that's our government doing that.
Right. I mean, simply for me, being an American is like, well, I have citizenship in this country whether or not I want it.
Sure.
I mean, so I'm a member of this nation that is in many ways the cultural hegemon. And I think it means that I have a responsibility to be critical of where I live. I think that I have a responsibility to be curious in a way that is incisive, that is asking questions that need to be asked. And I think it is also a responsibility to be creative, to think outside these boxes, to have conversations that need to be had. You know, to question systems of violence, to question systems of dehumanization, and ultimately to make a better world, a better universe, if you can, just by seeing the humanity in others. And that means seeing the humanity in those who aren't just American, who aren't just USian, right? Like seeing the humanity in those who are outside of those bounds. Because, you know, an America First ideology ultimately just helps perpetuate systems of violence against humans who are not American. So yeah, I mean, what it means to me is that I have a lot of responsibility. I think, like, given the privilege that I have, you know, like I could have very well, I mean, probably not super likely, but you know, like, given my dad's family's heritage, like, I could have ended up growing up poor in Mexico. I didn't. I grew up here, very comfortably middle class, and with a good education and great opportunities. And also a lot of those opportunities, I realize, were created for me or were put in place for me because the American project, in many ways, rests on decades, centuries of colonization, of dehumanization, of violence. So, I mean, like, it's not my load to bear alone. Like, it's something that I'm calling everyone to. Like, you have that responsibility too.
Of course, yes.
You know, like, everyone that I work with, I try to impress upon them, like, hey, like, we are trying to be an international organization, and that means that we as Americans have to highlight or be aware of the privilege that we have because of all of these histories of dehumanization, which means being able to enter spaces with humility instead of thinking that you're the authority everywhere.
I don't remember what everyone's answers have been to that question, but I think you're the first, if not one of the first, to talk about responsibility, and I love that. That might be one of my favorite answers that I've gotten. And I'm not like saying this to fish for compliment or anything, but I have always said that my responsibility to be a bridge builder is because there's no part of my identity that anybody can attack. There's nothing that anybody can say to me to harm me. I'll just laugh at whatever people call me. Like, it bounces right off. I don't care. And I can't ask other people who could be harmed to do it. So I have to, in some ways, I have to be the one to do it because it's not something that I can ask everyone to do.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I have often related to the idea of not just building a bridge, but being a bridge, right? I, at one point, told my spiritual director that I was tired. I was exhausted because I was existing in these spaces where I was pro-life and a feminist. And so, like, I didn't fit into the pro-life space super well, and I didn't fit into the feminist space super well, but I was both. And, I'm a queer Catholic. And so I don't fit into the queer spaces super well, and I don't fit into the Catholic spaces super well. And, like, I'm an anti-war person who stands up for the rights of embryos. So
God forbid those two things exist.
Right. So, you know, like, it's like not fitting in anywhere perfectly. And simultaneously fitting in just enough that you're calling everyone to be better. And being a bridge between these disparate communities, you know, it was being very draining at the time. And my spiritual director, God bless him, he said, you know, that's the nature of being a bridge, right? That you're going to exist in tension and that people are going to walk all over you without a second thought.
Interesting. Yeah, I like that.
And I like started laugh crying because I was like, you're appealing to the physics nerd in me. Like, this is amazing. Like, statics was one of my favorite classes. And because, yes, like, of course, bridges exist in tension. That's the nature of how they are able to stand.
Yeah.
And yes, we're walked all over and driven all over without a second thought.
To be fair, I think you've experienced much more of that than me. I haven't been, like, attacked or anything. I think people just ignore me. So.
Yeah, I mean,
So I'm fortunate enough to not have really been. I wouldn't say that I've been. I fully agree, but I wouldn't say. I guess I'm blessed enough. I haven't really been walked over quite yet.
Mm-hmm.
But it'll probably. I mean, at some point.
Yeah,
Who knows?
maybe. I think, it's a role that I think also requires us to rehumanize ourselves
Yeah.
and just to be real about how tense it can be, and also to be just open to everyone. Like I am not one of those the bridge between Juarez and El Paso where you have to stop and go through a border checkpoint. I'm just like, whatever. I'm open for everyone. Let's chat.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I wish more of our borders were like that. We're just open to humans, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
I'll have to send you a good friend of the show. Our good friend of the show, Claire Ashcraft, has an entire Substack on that entire idea that you exist in two different places at once without really belonging to either. It's kind of the whole point. So I'll have to send you that because I think you'd enjoy it.
It's a little liminal.
It is. It's a and I don't experience that as much,
Right.
but it is an interesting thing.
Mm-hmm.
What do you now, since we're still on the topic of America, what do you
Yeah.
think about American apathy?
Ooh. I mean, I think it's real easy to feel apathetic when you don't feel like you have real power to make real change.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's almost a trauma response to feeling like you don't matter and your opinion, your input don't matter. Because, if you don't matter, then what's the point of caring? And because if you do care, but you're not able to actually make a difference, then you run the risk of being hurt.
Yeah.
Right. So in that respect, like, I get it.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
yeah.
At the same time, I think apathy also just kind of gives away the world.
Mm-hmm.
It relinquishes our responsibility to ourselves and to each other, to our communities, to our families, to those that we care about. One of the things that I say in the final chapter of the book is that, ultimately, our vote in any one election is infinitesimally small.
Mm-hmm.
Like, maybe in an election for city council, you're talking one of thousands.
Sure.
That's still a very small percentage,
Mm-hmm.
right? If you're talking about for state house, you're talking about one for maybe tens of thousands.
Or millions.
Right.
The state.
Right.
State.
Right. Well, and then if you're talking about, like a presidential race, yes, you're talking about one of millions, certainly.
Yeah, one of 330.
Right.
Well, I guess
because it's
Sure.
well, yeah, and because it's calculated on a state level because of the electoral Congress or whatever.
The Electoral College.
College, that's the word.
Yeah.
Yeah, because of the Electoral College.
Which isn't a college, by the way.
Right. No, it's
not. It's not an institution of higher education.
No, college just meaning group of humans.
Yeah. No.
Right. Group of respected humans or
Sure.
something. I don't know. And so ultimately, the things that we do in our communities day in and day out are going to have more of an impact than any one vote in any given election.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So the thing that I try to impress upon people is make sure that you are not apathetic about the things that are happening in your community. Like,
right.
If you're apathetic about voting, I get it.
Mm-hmm.
But don't let that make you apathetic about your community as a whole. Mm-hmm. Make sure that you're doing things in your neighborhood, in your church, in your school, in your community, like whatever your sphere of influence is, make sure that you are doing something to try to make that a better space to be in, a better place for people to live, a better place for people to raise their families, a better place for people to learn, whatever it is. And that means existing in solidarity with others. It really means entering into the trials and tribulations of other people in our communities. And that's a hard thing to do. Like that takes a lot of work, but I think the reward is also generally a lot higher. And so when we enter into those spaces, those opportunities for giving ourselves and our lives to others, I think it honestly, like, it tears us out of our apathy to really encounter others in the vulnerability of their lives.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think social media has I would imagine that social media has contributed to that, because if you see something with your own eyes, you really can't ignore it as much as you can if it's a screen.
Right. Social media is a double-edged sword, man.
I'm such a social media hater. Like, I get that I get that there's been good, but I'm such a, I don't know. I have trouble sometimes not being mad at the fact that, that no one seemed to have any concern for what this might do to a generation of young people. I find it very tough sometimes to not be resentful about that sometimes.
Yeah, no, I get it. Like, it fried my brain, man. My brain is mush.
It cooked an entire generation.
Yeah.
And it's going to probably do it. And I've said that 1,000 times on this show.
Yeah. I mean, like, the good that I have seen is I have seen marginalized communities able to build relationships with each other through the internet, particularly people who are part of disabled communities, people who are part of LGBT communities, and people part of the pro-life community.
Yeah.
I like, this organization exists because I posted in some of the various pro-life groups that I was part of back in 2011. Hey, I'm thinking of doing like a conference or maybe a magazine on the consistent life ethic. Is anyone else interested? And one random guy I had never met in an LGBT pro-lifers group responded and was like, I'm interested. And we started the organization that day. And so, like, for that, I'm hugely grateful.
Of course, yeah.
At the same time, I also recognize that funneling all relationships through a screen without question has dehumanized our relationships. It has made it more easy to say violent and hateful things to people on the other side of the screen, right? Like, I don't care what ideology anyone has. Like, it makes dehumanizing the other person on the other side of that keyboard so much easier.
Yeah.
And I think it has, starved our in-person relationships.
Yes.
You know, there are so many times where I want to be having really excellent conversations with the people who are around me, and everyone is glued to their screens. And the thing is, like, I get it. Like,
I'm guilty of that.
I have ADHD. I too want to follow the endless scrolling down the dopamine sink. Like, yeah, my brain works the same way.
Yes.
And it infuriates me because I'm like, I really feel like I'm being taken advantage of. Like,
Sure.
Me and my neurodivergent brain are like helping monetize my whole life experience and, you know, making a shit ton of money for the folks at Facebook. And, well, I'm not on X anymore, but
I've never been.
Instagram is owned by Meta now. So, you know, right? And so is Threads. So it's like my whole life is owned by Mark Zuckerberg.
I was going to say it's all in service of the Zuck.
Yeah.
I don't know. I do feel, I feel pretty alienated by how eager this society seems to have everything be digital. Like, very much. It does not seem natural to me. I get that it's going to help a lot of people. I get that people are going to be helped, but I was terrified when I saw Apple roll out the headset, the Vision Pro thing, the new. Have you not seen this at all? Oh my God. Just look it up after this, after we're
Okay,
done.
I
Because
will.
it's their new
It's like a VR headset?
yeah, but like
Okay.
but you still see what's around you. It's like interface. It's like modified reality.
So is it like
or
Google
whatever.
Glass?
Yes, it's kind of like
Okay.
a Google Glass. It's
Okay.
it's the better. It's a chunkier Google Glass essentially, and you
Okay.
can. I mean, it's kind of cool. You can like. There was a video of a guy that was working on his car, and the headset was telling him. It was breaking down all the pieces. What do you need to buy? How do you fix it? Here's a YouTube video. That's cool. But somebody was like playing Angry Birds walking across a busy street. And that I don't think is a win for any of us. I don't think that we should be playing Angry Birds. I mean, this guy was locked the fuck in
Oh my
with this
gosh.
headset walking across the street. This was the most locked in person I've ever seen. It was unreal. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I have a novel. I don't know if it'll ever get written, but it like includes some of that technology and like just the dehumanization that's kind of inherent
Like a book that you have
with it.
sitting somewhere in a
No,
Google
no,
Doc?
sorry. A novel I'm working on
Okay.
that I've been working on for like 4 years that I stopped to write this
Oh,
instead.
Okay.
Because I kept trying to get a bunch of collaborative efforts in. I was like, okay, I'll break down each chapter, and each chapter will be written by a different author. And then it just kept falling apart, and I was like, fine, I'll write it myself.
Yeah.
So the novel's on pause, but yeah.
Okay. And just this is just one thing, and then we're gonna wrap up here.
Yeah.
But speaking of the Apple headset, and speaking of replacing myself with a chatbot, which
Is
I
that
am.
for real?
No, it's
Okay.
A bit. It's a bit.
Okay.
I do bits. Like I'm not a comedian, but I do bits because I have to bring levity sometimes. And I thought it was a really funny concept that like the AI would show up and it would go, "I'm not producing your fucking show. I want to be the show. It's my show. You produce it." Like that's very funny to me. So I was like, it would be hilarious if I just did a bit where I was like, because the new OpenAI text to video thing is really fucking good.
Okay.
It's crazy good. Like it's scary how good it is, and it's only gonna get better. So I was like, oh. It's not going to replace Gavin. It's going to replace me. Like I'm going to be the one that gets replaced. So that was like a bit. And then people did think it was real. They were like, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry." And I was like, "It's not. This is all of this is completely
I'm
fake."
glad to hear that.
But are you worried about artificial intelligence leading to new forms of discrimination?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it already has.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
That stuff with the Google Gemini was the crazy. Do you see that?
no, what's the Google Gemini?
Google Gemini is their version of ChatGPT.
Oh, okay.
And a couple of weeks ago, if you asked Google Gemini to show you the founding father, and again, this is an eclectic group, so just stay with me. It's like they asked it for various groups. They were like, show me historically accurate pictures of Nazis. And Google Gemini was like, here are Nazis. And they were black people in Nazi uniforms, Native Americans in Nazi uniforms, women in and then you did the same thing for, there was like an Asian founding father, there was a black founding father, so none of it was accurate at all. And they came under a ton of heat for that. But I'm like, that's gonna cause some problems if the chatbot can't. Like, is that not also rewriting history? Like, we criticize the right for rewriting the history books. This is the left doing that. This is a left-wing ideology that's present at Google that is leading to an inaccurate historical representation of people.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I had not heard about that.
It was it was the craziest thing I had seen.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I constantly am worried about things like genetic testing, and therefore like the knowledge of the human genome interwoven with AI at the service of violent industries.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something I think about a lot.
Are you saying like genetic modification essentially?
Not modification, extermination.
Okay. So exterminating some genetics.
Right.
From the
so,
human
for example, actually, was it yesterday? Today's the 22nd, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Yesterday was World Down Syndrome Day.
Okay.
Right. In Iceland, something over 90% of children diagnosed in utero with Down syndrome are aborted.
Yeah.
And so Iceland's like, we've eradicated Down syndrome. We're like, no, you've killed every child with Down syndrome. Likewise, children who are diagnosed in utero or embryos genetically tested for IVF, who test positive for intersex conditions, like those sorts of things could be used to destroy those embryos, to abort those prenatal children who, exemplify intersex conditions. Like these sorts of things are, I feel like, just the tip of the iceberg. Like if we're talking about bringing AI, bringing this level of technology into knowledge of the human genome, what we're setting up the stage for, I think, given that our society is not committed to nonviolence at every level, is we're setting the stage for extermination of people based on certain genetic factors.
Is that does Rehumanize have a position on, for example, if we get to a point where we can say we can eliminate Down syndrome, like through, I don't even know, like
CRISPR?
this is such a tricky thing, but like through some sort of genetic modification to remove birth defects, is that viewed as
like through CRISPR? Are you familiar with CRISPR?
I am, but that whole thing is maybe not a can of worms that we should open now at this point.
It's essentially like genetic modification for situations like this, for example, right? So like, it's certainly come up in conversation. I don't think like we have a specific stance on it as an organization. I think a lot of disability justice activists that I agree with would personally say that eliminating the disability as a whole could be, like, even if you're not killing the person, if you are doing genetic modifications to remove the genetic condition, it could be problematic. It could be anti-disabled human. I don't know. Like it could be ableist in a problematic way.
How so?
I think a lot of them would say that there's something about their disability that is part of their identity.
Okay.
That, and I don't necessarily agree with everything that like all disability justice activists are going to say, but there are arguments about like, could you take away all the bad parts of a disability but leave the other parts that are just like neutral.
Sure.
So
I guess like for example, that could maybe be like, and again, I am going to walk carefully when I say this because I'm not educated. I don't want to say anything wrong, not because I'm afraid to, but because I don't want to be incorrect about this. But like, there is, I believe, a trend of people with autism a lot of times having, like being very intelligent in certain areas, like having certain things that they're just really good at.
Yeah.
Would that be an example of like, that's eliminating a neutral thing or something that even is kind of special about that person at the expense of the disability?
Right. Well, and the thing is, I think even, it's like I'm also autistic. And there are people in the autism community, particularly, I would say, actually autistic people, not just like autism moms.
Sure.
Actually autistic people who would say that their experience is just part of the diversity of creation, like the diversity of the world, and it's a good thing, like to be autistic. And there are some people with like higher support needs who would say, no, like my condition is actually disabling. It isn't just that society doesn't accept me as my autistic self. There are some aspects of my autistic experience that would be disabling even if the culture was 100% autism friendly.
Sure.
And so like there's even disagreement like in the community of actually autistic people about, you know, whether like 100% of this experience is neutral or good, or some of it is bad.
Well, I'm glad that they're treating it like it's a complicated thing.
Yeah.
Like it would be annoying if they were like, no, this is simple.
Right. I think in general, I find a lot of humility in that space about like, hey, I know about my experience. I can't tell you what your experience is for you. And that's, I think one of the good things is like disability is such a unique experience. And even if we acknowledge that autism is a beautiful part of the diversity of creation, of the diversity of the world, it doesn't also mean that parts of it aren't also disabling. And, you know, like this also, I think, goes back to like intersex conditions. Like there are some people who view intersex conditions as like, oh, well, it's always, you know, like a negative thing. It's always like a bad mutation or a malformation of a human, as opposed to part of the diversity of human experience. And so like in the intersex community, there are a lot of people who are like, no, like we're just part of the diversity of humanity. Like our experience isn't bad. Our experience is neutral or good. And so it honestly, it really depends on all these different conditions like that you could be talking about. Like how would you want to respond to them if a child was diagnosed with them in the womb, or if there was a treatment for them, like what would you do? I think we probably need to listen to those people who have those conditions, who are experiencing life with those conditions now, to be able to, you know, like make good decisions in the future and make sure that we're not in this for like a really eugenic reason, you know, to try to eliminate these people.
What advice do you have for young people who want to get into nonprofit work, who want to do do you want to get involved with the work that you're doing, college students, high school students?
Yeah. I think the biggest nugget that I could give, biggest nugget of advice that I would give to any young person would be to get connected with your community, first of all. We have so many different ways that you can work with Rehumanize. Like, yes, you know, we're talking about reinvigorating our internship program from over 5 years ago at this point. But, you know, like that's just one opportunity. Like we have affiliate chapters, we have allied groups, we have all sorts of different tools on our website for being able to start good conversations, to get educated. Like I'd say a great starting place is by reading my book.
Yeah, I was gonna, something I didn't mention was that you have discussion questions at the end of each chapter. So this is like a thing that people can do together as a group, which I think is fantastic.
Yes. I really wanted this to be the sort of tool that groups could read together. You know, there's a bunch of further reading if you're like me and, you know, like this book is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the consistent life ethic. It's just a starting point.
Yeah.
And I really want to like say it's not the final word on anything. It is a starting place to jump off from. So get connected with your community wherever you are. Like if there are different groups you can be involved with on your college campus, you know, maybe like the Bridge USA chapter here at Point Park or at Pitt. If there's a pro-life group or a social justice group or a, you know, I know I marched recently with the Students for Justice in Palestine, you know, like for a Hands Off Rafah march. There are all sorts of different groups that exist. Get connected in your community with what already exists. I think for the most part. If nothing exists in your community, hit me up. Start a chapter, I guess, or but generally things already exist in your community, and getting connected there and building relationships where you live is usually the first and most important step towards building a sustainable relationship for change.
Mm-hmm. What is your favorite part of your job?
Oh, probably getting to have just like good conversations with people, especially where I can see like a light bulb moment, like those sorts of
We call those "I never thought of it that way" moments.
yeah.
That's it. Have you read that book?
No.
From Monica Guzman, who's a senior fellow at Braver
Yeah,
Angels.
so I have it on my like I need to buy this
Okay.
list when I get the money.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the book list.
Yes.
The book list will never end.
Right.
Truly, but that's my
Right.
favorite book that I've ever read.
Yes, I need to read it. I love Monica. She's amazing. But yes, this idea of like, oh, I'd never considered it that way, sort of thing. I love hearing that, because at the very least, what that means is they're encountering someone with a perspective either they hadn't taken super seriously or they'd never heard of before. And they're considering that perspective with openness, with curiosity, with humility, and with an eye towards the future. And that might not mean that they embrace that perspective, but it means that they have grown respect for you. And I think that's the starting point for all civic change. It's the starting point for creating a better world, is really building these relationships of respect with each other. So, I don't know, seeing those moments is excellent.
Yep. What gives you hope for the future?
That's a really big question, and I'm going to go with answering it in a very particular way.
Okay. Be as specific as you'd like.
Yeah. I'm going to say what brings me hope for the future lately, or like what lately have I seen that brings me hope for the future. And that is just so many young people, I think, engaging honestly with learning about the history of Palestine and standing for a ceasefire in Gaza. I think that has been just really heartening for me when I figured that the anti-war movement in this nation was more or less dead. Like, when I was in high school, I remember seeing videos and photos and news stories of all these anti-war marches opposing George W. Bush's entrance into a war in the Middle East, in Afghanistan, in Iraq. And I was so encouraged by that, and I really wanted to get involved, and really wasn't able to participate in like marches and stuff like that as a 17-year-old. And so seeing, like through the Obama years, I feel like the anti-war movement kind of got silent, really distressingly silent, given that there was still war happening, like that.
He dropped more bombs on the Middle East than any other president.
Yes. And that literally Americans were killed by American drones. And like practically no one did a thing about it. So that was very distressing time for me. Like, I was just entering college when the 2008 election happened. And I just felt so isolated. Really wanting to get involved with anti-war work, but not really seeing a place to get started. And so just seeing that be reinvigorated by and large by young people has been really encouraging for me. And I hope that it's something that will continue and that will carry forward and will really lead towards these young people seeing the humanity of each and every human being, because they're entering into this situation where caring about Palestinian people is not necessarily politically advantageous. It might be socially advantageous for young people in their social circles.
But in this country.
But in this country, politically speaking, it's not.
Yes.
And so I think entering into this situation where they are supporting a cause that isn't politically advantageous is very encouraging for me, because it means that they're willing to step outside the status quo, to step outside those boxes, and to question what we have, what we've been left with politically.
Okay. Thank you very much for joining me today. The book is fantastic. I recommend that people go buy it. Anything you want to plug right now? The floor is yours.
I am currently in the process of working on our own podcast as well.
Okay.
We have Rehumanize podcast, which you can find on Spotify, iTunes or whatever, and Podbean, etc. Like wherever you find your podcasts. And I am going to be recording an episode next month on the rights of embryos, which is, of course, a spicy topic that everyone's talking about because of the Alabama Supreme Court case.
Yes.
So, we have a lot of back episodes that people can check out, but I'm really excited about that one. So, if you're interested, tune in next month for that episode to come out.
For sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for joining me today. Really appreciated the conversation.
Yeah. Thanks, Carson.